as the world quiets and the stars begin to pierce the velvet sky, let us journey back to a time when shadows loomed large over the earth, when one man's ambition cast a darkness that would ripple through history. Tonight, we delve into the story of Adolf Hitler, a figure whose name evokes both dread and fascination. A man whose life shaped the course of the 20th century in ways both profound and tragic. This is not a tale of mere dates and events, but a woven tapestry of human choices, dreams, and devastations. A story told softly, to lull you into reflection as you drift toward sleep. Picture a small Austrian town at the dawn of a new century, where a boy named Adolf, born to a strict father and a doting mother, first opened his eyes to a world brimming with possibility. From those humble beginnings, a path unfolded, one that would lead to power, destruction, and a legacy that still haunts us. This video will guide you through his life, from the quiet streets of Braunau am Inn to the deafening roar of a world at war. We'll explore the forces that shaped him, the ideologies he wielded, and the consequences that followed, all in a gentle, storytelling tone designed to carry you into restful contemplation. Before we begin, I'd love to connect with you, my listener. Where are you watching this history unfold? Perhaps you're curled up under a blanket in New York, the clock ticking past midnight. Or maybe you're in a cozy room in London, where the early hours hush the city. Drop a comment below. Tell me your corner of the world and the time glowing on your clock. And if you find peace in these historical tales, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon so we can share more journeys through time. Your support keeps these stories alive, and I'm so grateful to have you here. Hello, my name is Sherry, and welcome to my channel. So let's begin. In the quiet, cobblestone streets of Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town nestled along the banks of the Inn River, the world was softer, simpler. In the spring of 1889, the air carried the scent of fresh-baked bread from local bakeries, and the gentle clatter of horse-drawn carts echoed through the narrow lanes. It was here, in a modest inn called the Gasthaus zum Palmer, that a child was born on April 20, a boy named Adolf, destined to leave an indelible mark on history, for better, or, as we now know, for far worse. The house stood unassuming, its whitewashed walls glowing faintly under the alpine sun, unaware that it cradled the infancy of a man who would one day shake the foundations of the world. Adolf Hitler was the fourth child of Alois and Clara Hitler, though only he and his younger sister, Paula, would survive into adulthood. The family's life in Braunau was one of modest means, shaped by the rhythms of a provincial town on the border of Austria and Bavaria. Alois, Adolf's father, was a stern, imposing figure, a customs official whose rigid demeanor seemed to carry the weight of his own tumultuous past. Born Alois Skickelgruber, he had only recently adopted the surname Hitler, a change that lent him a sense of legitimacy he fiercely guarded. Alois ruled the household with an iron hand, his expectations as unyielding as the alpine winds that swept through Braunau's winters. Discipline was his creed, and young Adolf, a sensitive boy with a spark of defiance, often felt the sting of his father's disapproval. Clara, in contrast, was the heart of the home, a gentle, devout woman whose love for her children was as boundless as the sky above the Inn Valley. Her soft voice and tender hands offered Adolf a refuge from his father's severity. She doted on him, perhaps sensing the fragility beneath his stubborn exterior. In her eyes, Adolf was not just a boy, but a dreamer, a child who sketched in the margins of his school books and lost himself in stories of heroes and conquests. Clara's warmth was a lighthouse in the storm of Elwai's temper, and it was her affection that young Adolf clung to, even as tensions simmered within the household. Life in Braunau was fleeting for the Hitlers. By 1892, Elwai's career prompted a move to Passau, then to Linz. But those early years in Braunau left their mark on Adolf. The town, with its blend of Austrian and Bavarian influences, hummed with a quiet pride in its German heritage. The young boy absorbed this, listening to tales of Germanic legends whispered by neighbors or sung in folk tunes. The seeds of identity were planted here, not yet the toxic nationalism of his later years, but a boyish fascination with the idea of belonging to something greater. He wandered the fields beyond the town, sketching the rolling hills or the spire of St. Stephen's Church, his imagination alight with visions of grandeur that clashed with the mundane reality of his father's expectations. School, however, was a battleground. Adolf was bright but willful, excelling when his interest was piqued, but resisting subjects that bored him. His teachers noted his talent for drawing and his quick wit, yet his grades faltered under the weight of his stubbornness. Elwai dreamed of his son following him into the civil service, a respectable path of order and stability. But Adolf, even at 10, bristled at the thought. He saw himself as an artist, a creator, not a clerk bound to ledgers. These early clashes with his father forged a quiet rebellion in him, a determination to carve his own path, no matter the cost. The tension between father and son was a silent undercurrent, like the steady flow of the Inn River, shaping the boy's spirit in ways no one could yet foresee. Clara's health, too, cast a shadow over these years. Her struggles with illness, though not yet dire, worried young Adolf. He would sit by her side, reading aloud or sharing his sketches, seeking her smile as a balm for his uncertainties. These moments of closeness with his mother nurtured a sensitivity in him, a capacity for devotion that would later twist into something far darker. But in Braunau, he was still just a boy, dreamy, defiant, and caught between the love of a mother and the demands of a father, unaware of the forces gathering within him. As the Hitlers prepared to leave Braunau for new horizons, the town faded into memory, but its echoes lingered in Adolf's heart. The pride of his Germanic roots, the weight of his father's expectations, and the warmth of his mother's love were threads woven into the fabric of his being. What would become of this boy, whose dreams soared beyond the confines of a small Austrian town? Would the world bend to his will, or would it break under the weight of his ambitions? As the stars twinkle above us now, let us follow him to Linz, where a restless youth begins to stir, searching for a purpose that will one day set the world ablaze. The streets of Linz, bathed in the golden light of an Austrian summer, stretched out before a young Adolf Hitler as he stepped into adolescence. It was the early 1900s, and the city, with its elegant Baroque buildings and bustling markets, felt like a world apart from the sleepy confines of Braunau am Inn. The Hitler family had settled here after a series of moves, drawn by Elwa's career and the promise of a fresh start. But for Adolf, now a lanky boy with piercing eyes and a stubborn streak, Linz was both a canvas for his dreams and a stage for his growing defiance. The air carried the scent of linden trees and the distant chime of church bells. But beneath the city's charm, a storm was brewing within the young man, a restlessness that would shape his path in ways no one could yet imagine. Elwa Hitler's iron grip tightened as Adolf entered his teenage years. The customs official, now nearing retirement, saw in his son a chance to fulfill his own unyielding vision of respectability. He demanded Adolf prepare for a career in the civil service, a life of paperwork and predictability that felt like a cage to the boy. Adolf, however, was consumed by grander visions. He spent hours sketching architectural fantasies, sweeping cathedrals, majestic theaters, his pencil dancing across pages, as if to escape the confines of his father's expectations. His school books, neglected in favor of these drawings, bore witness to a mind that yearned for creation, not conformity. Teachers at the Linz Realschule noted his intelligence, but despaired at his lack of discipline. He excelled in subjects like history and geography, where tales of Germanic heroes and empires sparked his imagination. But mathematics and languages were met with indifference, if not outright rebellion. The tension between father and son grew into a silent war. Elwa, with his booming voice and unyielding will, saw Adolf's artistic aspirations as childish folly. Harsh words and punishments became commonplace, each clash leaving deeper scars on the boy's spirit. Yet, in the quiet moments, Adolf found solace in his mother, Clara. Her gentle encouragement fueled his dreams, her soft reassurances a balm for the wounds inflicted by Elwa's disapproval. Clara, frail but steadfast, would listen as Adolf spoke of becoming a great artist, her eyes shining with pride even as her health began to falter. These moments, tucked away in the modest Hitler home, nurtured a sensitivity in Adolf that clashed with his growing anger, a duality that would later twist into something far more dangerous. Linz itself was a crucible for young Adolf's burgeoning ideas. The city, a cultural hub of Upper Austria, buzzed with debates about identity and nationhood. The rise of pan-German nationalism, a movement that glorified a unified German-speaking world, was impossible to ignore. Adolf, impressionable and eager for a cause, soaked up these ideas like a sponge. He read pamphlets and newspapers, captivated by stories of Germanic pride and the legacy of figures like Otto von Bismarck. At school, he clashed with teachers who taught the virtues of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, his young voice sharp with conviction as he championed a greater Germany. These early ideological sparks were not yet the fanaticism of his later years, but they glowed faintly, like embers waiting for kindling. Outside of school, Adolf lost himself in the romanticism of art and music. He attended operas, enthralled by the soaring dramas of Richard Wagner, whose music seemed to echo the grandeur he craved. Wagner's tales of gods and heroes stirred something deep within him, feeding his dreams of a world shaped by his will. He wandered Linz's streets, sketching bridges and buildings, imagining himself as the architect of a new era. Yet these dreams were tempered by a growing sense of isolation. His peers found him intense, even aloof, his sharp tongue and unshakable opinions setting him apart. Friendships were few, and Adolf preferred the company of his own thoughts, where he could craft a world free from his father's control. Tragedy struck in 1903 when Eloi died suddenly, collapsing in a local tavern. For Adolf, now 14, the loss was both a liberation and a burden. The weight of his father's expectations lifted, but so too did the structure of his world. Clara, now the sole anchor, moved the family to a smaller apartment in Linz, her health growing more fragile. Adolf's rebellion intensified. He left school at 16, his grades a patchwork of brilliance and neglect. Free from Eloi's shadow, he dreamed of studying art in Vienna, the cultural heart of the empire. But the path ahead was uncertain, and Clara's worsening condition cast a pall over his ambitions. He cared for her, reading to her and sketching by her bedside, his devotion a quiet counterpoint to his restless spirit. As Adolf stood on the cusp of manhood, Linz had shaped him in ways both subtle and profound. The city had fed his dreams of art and glory, but also his resentment, his sense of being misunderstood. The nationalist fervor he encountered, the music that stirred his soul, and the loss of his father had all left their mark. What would become of this restless youth, caught between his mother's love and his own burning ambitions? As the lights of Linz faded behind him, a new chapter loomed in Vienna, where dreams would be tested and a darker path would begin to take shape. The spires of Vienna gleamed under the autumn sun of 1907, a city of grandeur and contradiction, where imperial elegance met the grit of urban struggle. For an 18-year-old Adolf Hitler, arriving from the provincial calm of Linz, Vienna was a dreamscape, a place where ambition could take flight or be crushed beneath the weight of reality. The capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire pulsed with life. Horse-drawn carriages clattered along cobblestone streets. Coffee houses hummed with intellectual debate, and the air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and distant industry. But for young Adolf, clutching his sketches and a suitcase of hopes, Vienna would prove a crucible, forging his dreams into something harder, darker. As the city's harsh lessons shaped the man he would become, Adolf had come to Vienna to chase his vision of becoming a great artist. The Academy of Fine Arts, a beacon of prestige, was his goal. Its hallowed halls promising a path to the greatness he felt destined for. He spent his early days wandering the city's boulevards, sketching the ornate facades of the Hofburg Palace and the sweeping arches of the State Opera. His portfolio, filled with meticulous drawings of buildings and landscapes, was his ticket to a new life, or so he believed. But when he submitted his work to the Academy, the verdict was a blow. His technical skill was noted, but his art lacked the spark of originality needed for admission. The rejection stung, a wound to his pride that he masked with defiance. The professors suggested he try architecture, but Adolf, stubborn and untrained in the necessary disciplines, saw only failure in their words. The second rejection, a year later in 1908, was even more crushing. The Academy's doors remained closed, and Adolf's dreams of artistic glory began to fray. Vienna, once a city of promise, became a labyrinth of hardship. His savings, a small inheritance from his father, dwindled quickly. Clara, his beloved mother, was no longer there to offer solace. Her death from breast cancer in December 1907 had left Adolf unmoored, grieving in a city that cared little for his pain. He moved from boarding houses to cramped men's hostels, his belongings reduced to few clothes and his ever-present sketchbook. The elegance of Vienna's Ringstrasse stood in stark contrast to the squalor of his new reality, where he shared rooms with transients and laborers, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and cheap tobacco. In these lean years, Adolf's pride kept him from seeking steady work. He scraped by selling his paintings, small watercolors of Viennese landmarks, to tourists and frame shops, earning just enough to afford bread and a bed. The city's underbelly became his world: soup kitchens, crowded shelters, and the damp chill of winter nights spent on park benches. Yet, even in poverty, his mind burned with ambition. He spent hours in public libraries, reading voraciously history, philosophy, and political tracts, his hunger for knowledge as fierce as his hunger for food. Vienna's vibrant political scene, a cauldron of ideas, drew him in. The city was a patchwork of ethnicities: Germans, Czechs, Jews, Hungarians, each vying for influence in a crumbling empire. Nationalist fervor clashed with socialist ideals, and Adolf, ever the observer, absorbed the rhetoric swirling around him. It was in Vienna that the seeds of his later ideology took root. The city's anti-Semitic undercurrents, fanned by figures like Mayor Karl Lueger, found a receptive audience in the young man. Lueger's Christian Social Party blended populist charm with anti-Jewish rhetoric, painting Jews as scapegoats for economic woes. Adolf, already resentful of his own failures, began to echo these sentiments, though they were not yet the venomous obsession of his later years. He attended political rallies, listened to street orators, and read pamphlets that fueled his growing sense of grievance. The pan-German nationalism he had encountered in Linz grew stronger here, fed by the writings of Georg Ritter von Schörnerer, who dreamed of a unified German state free of foreign influences. These ideas, mixed with Adolf's personal struggles, began to shape a worldview rooted in anger and exclusion. Yet, Vienna was not all darkness. Adolf found solace in the city's cultural riches. He attended Wagner operas, standing in the cheap galleries, lost in the music's mythic grandeur. The ring cycle, with its tales of gods and betrayal, spoke to his sense of destiny, as if he, too, were meant for a heroic role. He sketched constantly, dreaming of redesigning Vienna's streets into monuments of Germanic pride. These moments of beauty and ambition kept him afloat, even as poverty and rejection gnawed at his spirit. He was a paradox, a dreamer adrift in a city that both inspired and rejected him, a young man whose sensitivity was hardening into something unyielding. By 1913, as Adolf neared his 24th birthday, Vienna had taught him resilience, but also resentment. The city had shown him the heights of human achievement and the depths of despair. His failures at the academy, the loss of his mother, and the sting of poverty had forged a bitterness that clung to him like damp clothes. But they had also sharpened his conviction, his belief that he was meant for something greater. As he packed his few belongings and turned his gaze toward Munich, a new chapter beckoned. What would this restless, embittered young man find in Germany on the brink of war? Would the world offer him redemption? Or would it become the stage for his darkest ambitions? As the Viennese night fades, let us follow him across the border, where history awaits its next turn. The summer of 1914 hung heavy over Munich, its streets alive with the clamor of a world teetering on the edge. The air was thick with the scent of beer halls and the distant rumble of history as Europe braced for war. For Adolf Hitler, now 25 and newly arrived from Vienna, the city offered a fresh start after years of struggle. Munich's vibrant Bavarian spirit, with its proud Germanic heritage, felt like home to the young man who had wandered too long in the shadows of failure. But when news of Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination broke, sparking the flames of World War I, Adolf saw not just a conflict, but a calling, a chance to prove himself in a world remade by fire and steel. In August 1914, as crowds gathered in Munich's Odeonsplatz, cheering the declaration of war. Adolf stood among them, his face alight with a fervor he had rarely shown. The photographs of that day capture him, a slight figure with intense eyes, swept up in the tide of patriotism. For Adolf, the war was more than a national cause. It was personal salvation, rejected by Vienna's art world, adrift in poverty. He now had a purpose. He enlisted in the Bavarian army, despite his Austrian citizenship, joining the 16th Bavarian Reserve Infantry Regiment. The act was a defiance of his past, a step toward a destiny he felt was his to claim. As he donned the gray uniform and shouldered a rifle, the weight of his failures seemed to lift, replaced by the promise of glory on the battlefield. The Western Front, where Adolf was sent in late 1914, was a world of mud and chaos. The trenches of Flanders, carved into the earth like open wounds, stretched endlessly under a sky choked with smoke. The air reeked of damp earth, gunpowder, and decay, and the constant roar of artillery became a grim lullaby. Adolf served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts under relentless shell fire. It was dangerous work, demanding courage and quickness, and he threw himself into it with a zeal that surprised his comrades. The boy who had rebelled against schoolroom discipline now embraced the structure of military life, finding in its order a sense of belonging he had never known. Life in the trenches was a brutal teacher. Adolf witnessed the carnage of battles like Ypres and the Somme, where men fell in waves, their cries swallowed by the din of war. He was wounded in 1916, a shell fragment tearing into his thigh during the Battle of the Somme, and spent months recovering in a German hospital. Yet even in pain, he wrote letters to his comrades, his words burning with conviction about Germany's destiny. The war fed his growing nationalism, the camaraderie of the trenches reinforcing his belief in a united German spirit. He earned the Iron Cross, second class, for bravery, a badge he would later wear with pride, proof that he was no longer the aimless dreamer of Vienna, but a soldier with a cause. But the war also deepened his resentments as he huddled in dugouts, reading newspapers or listening to the grumbling of fellow soldiers. Adolf absorbed the growing narrative of betrayal. Politicians, profiteers, and outsiders, particularly Jews, were blamed for Germany's struggles, their supposed disloyalty a convenient scapegoat for the war's toll. These ideas, already planted in Vienna, took deeper root in the mud of Flanders. Adolf's anti-Semitism, once a vague prejudice, began to harden into a worldview, though it remained a quiet ember, not yet the blaze that would consume his later years. The war gave him enemies to hate, a nation to idolize, and a sense of purpose he had never known. The camaraderie of the trenches, however, was not without its contradictions. Adolf was an odd figure among his fellow soldiers, aloof, rarely joining in their body humor or drinking bouts. He preferred to sketch or read, his intensity setting him apart. Yet he was reliable, even admired, for his willingness to brave the hail of bullets as a runner. His comrades nicknamed him Addy, a softer moniker for a man whose edges were sharpening. He formed a bond with a small dog, a stray he named Foxel, whose companionship offered a rare glimpse of the sensitivity that still lingered beneath his growing hardness. When Foxel was lost in 1917, stolen or killed, Adolf's grief was palpable, a reminder of the boy who had once clung to his mother's side. By 1918, the war was turning against Germany. The Allied offensives battered the German lines, and Adolf, now a battle-hardened veteran, was gassed near Ypres, the mustard gas burning his eyes and sending him to a hospital in Pacewalk. There, blind and helpless, he heard the news of Germany's surrender and the Treaty of Versailles, a document that would strip the nation of land, pride, and power. The betrayal cut deep, fueling a rage that would define his future. The war had awakened something in him, a sense of destiny, a hatred for perceived enemies, and a belief that he could reshape a broken nation. As Adolf lay in that hospital bed, his eyes slowly healing, the world outside was shifting. The Germany he had fought for was crumbling, its people hungry and disillusioned. What would this soldier, forged in the crucible of war, do with the fire now burning in his heart? Would he find a new battlefield, one where his voice, not his rifle, would become his weapon? As the echoes of war fade into the night, let us follow him back to Munich, where a new movement awaits, ready to harness his restless energy. The Munich of 1919 was a city adrift, its cobblestone streets scarred by the echoes of a lost war. The air carried the bitter tang of coal smoke and defeat, as Germany grappled with the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. For Adolf Hitler, now 30, the city was both a refuge and a crucible. Discharged from the army, his iron cross pinned to a threadbare coat, he returned to a nation fractured by hunger, unrest, and the specter of revolution. The vibrant Munich he had glimpsed before the war was gone, replaced by a restless energy. Communist uprisings clashed with nationalist fervor, and beer halls buzzed with angry voices. In this chaos, Adolf found not despair, but opportunity, a chance to channel the fire kindled in the trenches into a voice that would soon command attention. No longer the aimless dreamer of Vienna, Adolf was a man hardened by war, his eyes sharp with purpose. Yet he was still a loner, a figure who haunted Munich streets, his meager army pension barely enough to afford a rented room. The military, reluctant to let go of a reliable soldier, kept him on as an informant, tasked with observing the city's political undercurrents. It was a role that suited his keen observation and growing resentment. Munich was a hotbed of radical groups, from Bolshevik-inspired councils to nationalist cells dreaming of a reborn Germany. Adolf, with his knack for rhetoric honed in the trenches, was sent to infiltrate one such group, a small, obscure gathering called the German Workers' Party, meeting in the smoky backroom of a beer hall. The Sternecker Brau was no grand stage, just a dimly lit tavern where a handful of men, mostly workers and ex-soldiers, vented their frustrations. When Adolf attended his first meeting in September 1919, he found the group's ideas, a blend of nationalism and anti-capitalist sentiment, intriguingly close to his own. But it was their lack of fire that struck him most. The speakers droned, the debates meandered, and the room felt more like a grumbling club than a movement. When a speaker suggested Bavaria break away from Germany, Adolf could not stay silent. He rose, his voice cutting through the haze, delivering a passionate defense of a united German nation. The room fell quiet, heads turned, and for the first time, Adolf felt the power of his words to sway a crowd. The party's founder, Anton Drexler, saw potential in this intense young man and invited him to join. Adolf accepted, not out of loyalty, but because he saw a platform to mold. The German Workers' Party, with its vague ideals and small membership, was clay in his hands. He began attending meetings regularly, his speeches growing bolder, his ideas sharper. He spoke of Germany's betrayal by politicians and Jews, echoing the scapegoating he had absorbed in Vienna and the trenches. His words, raw and fervent, resonated with men who felt cheated by the war's end. Membership grew, drawn by this unknown orator whose passion seemed to light the dimmest rooms. Adolf, once rejected by Vienna's elites, now found purpose in these crowded taverns where his voice could shape the anger of the defeated. The transformation of the German Workers' Party into the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, was Adolf's doing. He pushed for a new name, one that fused nationalism with a nod to socialism, appealing to both patriots and workers. He designed the party's symbol, the swastika, its stark black lines on a red and white banner evoking ancient power and Germanic pride. Meetings moved to larger halls, like the Hofbrauhaus, where hundreds gathered to hear him speak. Adolf's oratory was not polished, but it was electric, his voice rising and falling, his hands slashing the air, his eyes burning with conviction. He spoke of a Germany reborn, free from the shackles of Versailles, a nation for true Germans. The crowds, hungry for hope, roared their approval, and Adolf felt the stirrings of destiny. Yet, this was no overnight triumph. Adolf worked tirelessly, writing pamphlets, organizing rallies, and recruiting allies. Men like Ernst Röhm, a battle-scarred officer, and Rudolf Hess, a quiet intellectual, joined his cause, drawn by his charisma and unrelenting drive. The party's platform, the 25 points, blended nationalist fervor with anti-Semitic tropes and calls for land reform, a mix designed to inflame passions. Adolf's rhetoric grew sharper, his hatred for Jews and Marxists more explicit, though still tempered by the need to build a following. Munich's beer halls, once places of solace, became stages for his vision, each speech a step toward a movement that would soon shake the nation. But Adolf was not yet a leader of consequence. The Nazi Party was still a fringe group, one of many vying for attention in a fractured Germany. His days were spent in smoky rooms, his nights in a sparse apartment, sketching propaganda or reading military histories. The war had given him purpose, but Munich gave him a voice. As he stood before growing crowds, he began to believe he could be more than a soldier or an artist. He could be a savior. What would happen when this voice, still confined to Munich's taverns, reached a wider stage? Would it ignite a nation, or would it falter in the face of greater forces? As the lights of the beer halls dim, let us linger in Munich, where a movement takes its first steps and a man begins to dream of power. In the autumn of 1923, Munich simmered with discontent, its streets alive with the restless energy of a nation battered by defeat and economic ruin. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves and the sharp tang of beer, as the city's taverns became cauldrons of political fervor. Germany was crumbling under the weight of the Treaty of Versailles, its currency worthless, its people hungry and humiliated. For Adolf Hitler, now 34 and the fiery voice of the fledgling Nazi Party, this chaos was a spark waiting to ignite. In the smoky halls of Munich, he saw not just a city, but a stage for a daring gamble, a coup that would thrust him from the fringes of politics into the heart of Germany's future. The Nazi Party, though growing, was still a small player in a crowded field of agitators. Hitler's speeches in beer halls like the Hofbrauhaus drew hundreds, sometimes thousands, their cheers fueling his belief that he was destined to lead. But Germany's government, weak as it was, clung to power in Berlin, and Bavaria's own leaders, conservative but wary, kept the Nazis at arm's length. Hitler, impatient and emboldened, looked to the example of Mussolini, whose march on Rome had seized power in Italy the previous year. If a bold stroke could topple a government there, why not in Munich? The idea took root, and by November 1923, Hitler and his allies, men like Ernst Röhm and Hermann Göring, hatched a plan to seize Bavaria and march on Berlin, remaking Germany in their image. The Buiger Braukeller, a sprawling beer hall in Munich, was chosen as the stage. On the night of November 8, 1923, Gustav von Kahr, Bavaria's state commissioner, was set to address a crowd of notables alongside other local leaders. The hall buzzed with the clink of mugs and the hum of conversation, unaware of the storm about to break. Hitler, clad in a dark suit, his eyes alight with resolve, burst in with a band of SA stormtroopers, their boots thundering on the wooden floor. He fired a pistol into the ceiling, the crack silencing the crowd, and declared a national revolution. The room, packed with stunned onlookers, became a theater of chaos as Hitler and his men herded Kahr and his allies into a side room, demanding their support at gunpoint. The plan was audacious, but flawed. Hitler, ever the orator, believed his charisma could sway the Bavarian leaders and rally the masses. He stood on a table, his voice ringing out, proclaiming the overthrow of the government and the dawn of a new Germany. Some in the crowd cheered, swept up by his passion. Others sat in uneasy silence. But Kahr and his colleagues, though coerced into a shaky agreement, were not true believers. As Hitler left to coordinate elsewhere, trusting his allies to hold the hall, the plan began to unravel. The leaders slipped away, and by morning, the city was on alert, loyalist forces mobilizing to crush the uprising. The next day, November 9, Hitler and his followers, some 2,000 strong, including SA men and loyalists like Rudolf Hess, marched through Munich streets, their swastika banners snapping in the chill wind. The Odeonsplatz, a grand square framed by neoclassical buildings, was their destination, a symbolic heart of the city. But the police, backed by the military, were ready. As the marchers approached, a barricade of armed men blocked their path. Shots rang out, the air thick with smoke and the cries of the wounded. Goering fell, hit in the groin. Hitler, knocked to the ground, dislocated his shoulder. 16 Nazis and 4 policemen died in the brief clash, and the march collapsed into chaos. Hitler fled, hiding in a supporter's home, but was arrested 2 days later. His revolution in tatters, the Beer Hall Putsch, as it became known, was a failure. Yet it marked a turning point. Hitler's arrest brought him before a courtroom in Munich, where he transformed defeat into a stage. The trial, meant to bury him, became a platform for his ideas. Facing charges of high treason, he spoke not as a defendant, but as a prophet, railing against the traitors of Versailles and the weak Weimar government. His words, reported in newspapers across Germany, reached far beyond Munich's beer halls. The judges, sympathetic to his nationalism, handed down a lenient sentence, 5 years in Landsberg prison, of which he would serve less than 1. The putsch, though a debacle, made Hitler a national figure, no longer just a local agitator, but a name whispered in homes and taverns. In the quiet of his cell, Hitler began to reflect, his ambition undimmed. The putsch had taught him that power would not come through reckless coups, but through strategy, propaganda, and the slow seduction of a nation. As he sat in Landsberg, the world outside churned with unrest, waiting for a voice to give it shape. What would this man, now a martyr to some, do with the lessons of his failure? Would his words, born in the ashes of a failed revolution, find new life in a Germany desperate for change? As the Munich night settles around us, let us enter the prison walls, where a book and a vision are taking shape, ready to reshape the world. The stone walls of Landsberg prison rose stark against the Bavarian countryside, their gray bulk a silent sentinel in the spring of 1924. Within, Adolf Hitler, now 35, sat in a modest cell, the echo of his failed Beer Hall Putsch still ringing in his ears. The world outside buzzed with the clatter of a fractured Germany. But here, in this quiet confinement, time slowed to a whisper. The air smelled of damp stone and old paper, and the narrow window offered glimpses of a sky that seemed both distant and forgiving. For most, prison was a place of despair, but for Hitler, it was a crucible, a chance to reflect, to write, and to forge a vision that would one day shake the world. Landsberg was no harsh dungeon. Hitler's sentence, a lenient 5 years for high treason, came with comforts unusual for a prisoner. His cell, spacious by prison standards, held a wooden table, a chair, and a small stack of books. Supporters sent gifts, food, flowers, letters, turning his confinement into something closer to a retreat. The guards, sympathetic to his nationalist fervor, treated him with deference, allowing visitors like Rudolf Hess and Emil Morris to join him. Yet, despite these privileges, Hitler was restless. The putsch had been a humiliating failure, its collapse exposing his impulsiveness. But in that failure, he saw a lesson. Power would come not through force alone, but through the slow, relentless shaping of minds. It was here, in the stillness of Landsberg, that Hitler began to write. Armed with a typewriter and reams of paper, he poured his thoughts into a manuscript that would become Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The title was apt, for the book was both a personal reckoning and a manifesto for a new Germany. Guided by Hess, who acted as secretary, Hitler wove together his life story with a venomous ideology. The pages burned with his resentment of the Treaty of Versailles, of the Weimar government, of Jews and Marxists he blamed for Germany's woes. His time in Vienna and the trenches had given him enemies. Now Landsberg gave him the words to define them. The prose was turgid, often rambling, but it carried a raw conviction that would later captivate a desperate nation. Mein Kampf was more than a book. It was a window into Hitler's mind. He wrote of a Germany reborn, a nation purified of foreign influences, united under a single will, his will. Antisemitism, once a vague prejudice, became a cornerstone, with Jews cast as the eternal enemy, responsible for every societal ill. Social Darwinism, drawn from half-understood readings in Vienna, shaped his vision of a world where the strong must dominate the weak. He dreamed of Lebensraum, living space, for Germans in the East, a fantasy of conquest rooted in the myths of Germanic destiny he had absorbed as a boy. The book was not a plan, but a fever dream, its pages a map to a future he believed he could create. Prison life gave Hitler time to refine his ideas, but also to reflect on his methods. The putsch had shown him the limits of brute force. Now, he began to see the power of propaganda, organization, and patience. He read voraciously Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, military histories, his mind sharpening even as his body softened in confinement. Visitors brought news of the Nazi Party's struggles without him, its members scattered and demoralized. Yet, Hitler's confidence grew. Letters from supporters across Germany, inspired by his trial speeches, convinced him his voice could reach beyond Munich. Landsberg, far from breaking him, became a stage for reinvention. The prison routine was simple meals, exercise, writing, but Hitler's thoughts were anything but. He paced his cell, dictating to Hess or arguing with visitors, his voice rising with the cadence of the speeches he longed to deliver. He spoke of destiny, of a Germany that would rise from its ashes, and his companions listened, captivated by his certainty. Even in confinement, he was a performer, his cell a rehearsal space for the role he would soon play. The swastika, the party's symbol, hung in his mind like a talisman, its stark lines a promise of the order he would impose. By December 1924, after just 9 months, Hitler was released. The Bavarian authorities, under pressure and swayed by his growing mythos, set him free. He emerged from Landsberg not as a broken man, but as a figure transformed. Mein Kampf, though unfinished, was nearly complete, its pages a blueprint for his ambitions. The prison had not tamed him, it had focused him, turning his raw anger into a calculated vision. Munich awaited, its beer halls and streets ready to hear his voice again. But now, he knew the game was not won by pistols, but by words, by rallies, by the slow seduction of a nation's soul. As Hitler stepped into the winter air, the world felt different. Germany was still broken, its people still desperate, but he carried a book and a belief that he could bend history to his will. What would happen when this man, armed with a manuscript and a burning ambition, returned to the stage? Would his words find fertile ground in a nation yearning for salvation? Or would they fade into the chaos of a fractured land? As the prison gates close behind us, let us return to Munich, where a movement stirs once more, and a voice prepares to rise. The Munich of 1925 was a city caught in a fragile calm, its streets lined with the ghosts of a lost war and the faint hope of a weary republic. The air carried the scent of fresh bread from bakeries and the distant clang of trams. But beneath the surface, Germany simmered with discontent. Adolf Hitler, newly released from Landsberg prison, stepped back into this world at 35, his eyes burning with a renewed sense of purpose. The failure of the Beer Hall Putsch had not broken him. It had sharpened his resolve. With Mein Kampf as his gospel and the Nazi Party as his instrument, he set out to rebuild a movement, weaving his voice into the fabric of a nation desperate for salvation. The Nazi Party, banned after the Putsch, was in disarray, its members scattered and its coffers empty. Hitler, barred from public speaking by Bavarian authorities, faced a daunting task. Yet the prison years had taught him patience, and he worked in the shadows, meeting loyalists in dimly lit apartments and quiet cafes. In February 1925, the ban on the party was lifted, and Hitler seized the moment. The Bürgerbräukeller, the same beer hall where his coup had faltered, became his stage once more. On a cold evening, he addressed a crowd of thousands, his voice low at first, then rising like a storm, railing against the Treaty of Versailles and the enemies. Within, the audience, hungry for hope, roared, and Hitler knew his time was coming. His oratory was his greatest weapon. In the cavernous halls of Munich, Nuremberg, and beyond, Hitler spoke with a fervor that seemed to ignite the air. His speeches were not polished lectures, but raw performances, his hands slashing, his eyes locking onto the crowd, his words weaving tales of a glorious Germany betrayed by Jews, communists, and weak politicians. He spoke to the unemployed, the veterans, the shopkeepers crushed by inflation, offering them not just answers, but enemies to blame. The swastika banners, bold and unyielding, framed his words, their stark black lines a promise of order in a chaotic world. Crowds swelled, drawn by a man who seemed to channel their anger and dreams. Hitler's strategy was deliberate. The putsch had shown him the limits of force. Now, he embraced the ballot box, aiming to conquer Germany legally. He reorganized the Nazi Party, building a network of local branches across the country. Men like Joseph Goebbels, a sharp-tongued propagandist, and Heinrich Himmler, a meticulous planner, joined his inner circle, each amplifying his vision. Goebbels, with his knack for words, turned newspapers and posters into weapons, painting Hitler as a savior. The SA, the party's brown-shirted stormtroopers, grew into a disciplined force, their marches a show of strength that both intimidated and inspired. The party's message, rooted in Mein Kampf, was simple yet potent: national pride, racial purity, and a return to greatness. Germany's woes were Hitler's opportunity. The Weimar Republic, fragile from its birth, staggered under economic strain. The brief stability of the mid-1920s crumbled as inflation and unemployment returned, gnawing at the hopes of ordinary Germans. Farmers faced falling prices, workers faced joblessness, and the middle class saw their savings vanish. Hitler's speeches, now permitted again, struck a chord. He promised jobs, security, and a Germany free from the shame of Versailles. His anti-Semitism, once a secondary note, grew louder, tapping into old prejudices and new fears. Jews were cast as the architects of every crisis, a narrative that found eager ears in a nation seeking scapegoats. The Nazi Party's rise was not just Hitler's doing. He cultivated an image, a myth of the infallible leader. Photographs showed him stern yet approachable, a man of the people yet above them. Rallies became spectacles, with torches, flags, and chants, creating a sense of unity that Germany craved. Young people, especially, flocked to the cause, drawn by the Hitler Youth and its promise of purpose. Women, too, found a place in the Nazi vision, idealized as guardians of a pure German home. By 1928, the party had grown from a fringe group to a national presence, though its electoral gains were modest, winning just 12 seats in the Reichstag. Hitler, undeterred, saw the future in the faces of his crowds. Yet, beneath the growing momentum, cracks lingered. The SA's thuggery alienated some, and Hitler's obsession with control strained relations with allies like Röhm, who wanted a more revolutionary path. The party's funds, often from wealthy backers, were stretched thin, and Hitler himself lived modestly, his life consumed by speeches and strategy. His personal world was small, no family, few friends, but his ambition was boundless. He spent nights in his Munich apartment, sketching propaganda or reading, his mind fixed on the day he would lead Germany. As the decade neared its end, the world was about to shift. The Wall Street crash of 1929 loomed, promising to plunge Germany deeper into despair. Hitler, ever watchful, sensed the moment approaching when his voice could drown out all others. What would happen when a nation, broken and desperate, turned to this man and his promises? Would his movement sweep him to power, or would Germany resist the tide of his ambition? As the lights of Munich's beer halls flicker, let us linger in these restless years, where a man and a movement stand poised to seize a nation's soul. The winter of 1933 cloaked Germany in a chill that went beyond the weather. As the nation teetered on the edge of collapse, the streets of Berlin, once vibrant with the promise of the Weimar Republic, now echoed with the shuffle of unemployed workers and the shouts of rival factions. The air carried the scent of coal fires and desperation as the Great Depression tightened its grip, leaving millions jobless and hopeless. Adolf Hitler, now 43, stood at the helm of a Nazi party that had grown from a Munich fringe group to a national force. His voice, once confined to beer halls, now thundered across radio waves, and his swastika banners fluttered over towns and cities. The stage was set for a daring gambit, one that would propel him from agitator to the pinnacle of power. The Nazi Party's rise had been meteoric. By 1930, the economic crash had turned Germany's despair into votes, with the Nazis winning 107 seats in the Reichstag, making them the second largest party. By July 1932, they were the largest, with 230 seats, though still short of a majority. Hitler's speeches, amplified by Joseph Goebbels's propaganda machine, painted him as Germany's savior, a man who could restore pride, jobs, and order. His rallies, choreographed spectacles of torchlight and flags, drew tens of thousands, their cheers drowning out the doubts of a fractured nation. Yet, power remained elusive. The Weimar government, led by President Paul von Hindenburg, and a series of weak chancellors, viewed Hitler with suspicion, seeing him as a demagogue unfit for leadership. Hitler's path to power was not a straight march, but a chess game of patience and cunning. He refused offers to join coalition governments unless granted the chancellorship, betting that Germany's chaos would force Hindenburg's hand. Behind the scenes, he courted industrialists and conservatives, promising stability and a bulwark against communism. Men like Franz von Papen, a former chancellor, and Alfred Hugenberg, a media baron, saw in Hitler a tool to advance their own agendas, underestimating his ambition. The Nazi Party's SA stormtroopers, now numbering in the hundreds of thousands, flexed their muscle in the streets, clashing with communists and intimidating opponents. The violence, though alarming, convinced many that only a strong hand could restore order. On January 30, 1933, the gambit paid off. Hindenburg, weary of political gridlock and pressured by conservative elites, appointed Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The moment was surreal. A man once dismissed as a failed artist now stood at the helm of a nation. That night, torchlit SA parades snaked through Berlin, their boots pounding the pavement as swastika flags cast long shadows. Hitler, standing at the chancellery window, saw not just a victory, but a destiny unfolding. Yet, his grip on power was fragile. The cabinet was filled with conservatives who believed they could control him, and the Reichstag remained a battleground. Hitler knew he needed more than a title to reshape Germany. The Reichstag fire on February 27, 1933, was the spark he needed. The Parliament building went up in flames, its dome a silhouette against a blazing sky. A young Dutch communist, Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested, but Hitler and Goebbels seized the moment, blaming a broader communist plot. Whether the fire was a lone act or a convenient setup remains a shadow in history, but its impact was undeniable. Hitler declared a national emergency, convincing Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag fire decree, suspending civil liberties, freedom of speech, press, and assembly vanished overnight. The SA and police rounded up communists, socialists, and other enemies, their cells filling with the first victims of a new order. The decree was only the beginning. Hitler pushed for the Enabling Act, a law that would allow his government to enact laws without Reichstag approval, effectively dismantling democracy. On March 23, 1933, in a tense session at Berlin's Kroll Opera House, the Reichstag convened under the shadow of SA and SS intimidation. Catholic Center Party votes, swayed by promises of protection, tipped the balance. The act passed, handing Hitler dictatorial powers. He could now govern by decree, rewriting laws and reshaping Germany at will. The Weimar Republic, already frail, was dead in all but name. Its ideals swept away like ash from the Reichstag's ruins. Hitler's consolidation was swift and ruthless. Political parties were banned, trade unions dissolved, and newspapers silenced or co-opted. The SA and the newly formed SS, under Heinrich Himmler, enforced compliance, their presence a constant threat. Hitler's speeches, broadcast nationwide, promised a 1,000-year Reich, a vision of unity and strength that captivated a weary populace. Yet, beneath the rhetoric, a darker machinery was taking shape, laws targeting Jews, stripping them of rights, and a bureaucracy gearing up to enforce racial purity. The Germany Hitler envisioned was emerging, its foundations laid in fear and fervor. As 1933 drew to a close, Hitler stood at the precipice of absolute power, but the path ahead was fraught with challenges. The SA's growing unrest, the suspicions of his conservative allies, and the expectations of a desperate nation loomed large. What would this man, now holding Germany's reins, do with the power he had won? Would his vision unite a broken nation, or would it lead to a darkness none could yet foresee? As the Berlin night settles, let us step into the new Germany, where a Reich takes shape, and a leader's dreams begin to reshape the world. In the spring of 1933, Germany awoke to a new reality. Its cities draped in the red, white, and black of swastika banners, fluttering like dark omens. The air carried the scent of spring blossoms, but beneath it lingered a tension, a quiet fear that settled into the bones of a nation. Adolf Hitler, now Chancellor, stood at the helm of a country he vowed to remake. Berlin's streets, once alive with the clamor of debate, now echoed with the synchronized boots of SA stormtroopers and the crackle of radios broadcasting Hitler's voice. The Weimar Republic was a fading memory, and in its place, a new Reich was taking shape, one built on control, fear, and a vision that promised glory, but sowed the seeds of darkness. Hitler moved swiftly to consolidate his power. The Enabling Act, passed in March 1933, gave him the tools to reshape Germany without opposition. Political parties, from communists to centrists, were outlawed, their leaders arrested or driven into exile. Trade unions, a bastion of worker resistance, were crushed, replaced by the Nazi-controlled German Labor Front. Newspapers and radio stations fell under Joseph Goebbels' ministry of propaganda, their words now echoing the party's gospel. The Reichstag, once a symbol of democracy, became a hollow stage for Hitler's decrees. The SA and SS, their brown and black uniforms a constant presence, patrolled streets and meeting halls, silencing dissent with fists and fear. The creation of a totalitarian state was meticulous. Hitler's regime wove a web of surveillance and control, with Heinrich Himmler's SS and the newly formed Gestapo secret police rooting out enemies real and imagined. Denunciations became commonplace, neighbors turned on neighbors, and whispers of disloyalty could lead to midnight arrests. The regime's slogan, Ein Volk, Ein Reich, Ein Führer, one people, one empire, one leader, became a mantra, chanted at rallies and etched into the nation's psyche. Hitler, portrayed as the infallible Führer, was no longer just a man, but a myth. His image plastered on posters, his voice a constant presence in homes and schools. The Nazi vision extended beyond politics to the very fabric of society. The The regime glorified a mythic German identity, rooted in blood and soil, celebrating rural life and Aryan purity. Schools taught children to revere Hitler, their textbooks rewritten to exalt Germanic history. The Hitler Youth molded boys into soldiers, girls into future mothers of the Reich, their young faces glowing with a fervor that masked the loss of freedom. Culture, too, was harnessed. Art, music, and literature deemed degenerate were banned, replaced by works that glorified the Nazi ideal. Wagner's operas blared at state events, their grandeur a soundtrack to Hitler's dreams. But the darkest thread of this new Reich was its assault on those deemed unworthy. In April 1933, the regime launched a boycott of Jewish businesses. SA men standing menacingly outside shops, their signs branding Jews as enemies. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship, banning marriage or relations with Aryans, and relegating them to pariahs. Jewish doctors, lawyers, and teachers lost their livelihoods, their lives shrinking to ghettos and whispers of fear. Other groups, Roma, disabled people, political dissidents, faced similar persecution, labeled as undesirables in a society obsessed with purity. Concentration camps, like Dachau near Munich, emerged as grim holding pens, their barbed wire a harbinger of horrors to come. Hitler's speeches, now broadcast nationwide, promised a reborn Germany, jobs, pride, and strength. The economy, battered by the Depression, showed signs of recovery, fueled by public works and rearmament. Autobahns stretched across the countryside, their sleek lines a symbol of progress. Factories hummed, producing weapons in defiance of Versailles, and unemployment fell. To many Germans, weary of chaos, Hitler's order seemed a miracle, his promises a balm for their wounds. But this prosperity came at a cost. Freedom was traded for security, and dissent was a luxury few could afford. Yet tensions simmered beneath the surface. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, grew restless, demanding a second revolution to reshape society more radically. Their thuggery, once useful, now embarrassed Hitler, who sought respectability among elites. In June 1934, the Night of the Long Knives saw the SS purge the SA leadership, with Röhm and others executed in a bloody sweep. The move shocked Germany, but cemented Hitler's absolute control. The SS rising as his most loyal enforcers. When Hindenburg died in August 1934, Hitler merged the presidency and chancellorship, declaring himself Führer, answerable to no one. The Reich was taking shape, its machinery oiled by fear, propaganda, and ambition. Hitler, standing at rallies before seas of adoring faces, saw his vision coming to life. A Germany unified, purified, and ready to reclaim its place in the world. But the cost was already visible in the haunted eyes of those stripped of rights, in the silence of once vibrant voices. What would this new Germany, forged in the crucible of Hitler's will, become as it looked beyond its borders? Would the world bend to the Führer's ambition? Or would it resist the shadow now spreading from Berlin? As the swastika banners sway in the night breeze, let us turn our gaze outward, where a restless Reich prepares to challenge the world. The Germany of 1936 pulsed with a newfound confidence, its cities adorned with the bold red of swastika flags, and the hum of factories churning out the machinery of a reborn nation. The air carried the scent of diesel and determination, as Adolf Hitler, now Führer, stood at the zenith of his power. Berlin, with its grand boulevards and gleaming Reich chancellery, was the heart of a Reich that no longer bowed to the shame of Versailles. Yet Hitler's gaze stretched beyond Germany's borders, to a world he believed destined to bend to his will. The road to war was being paved, step by calculated step, as the Führer tested the limits of a weary Europe, each move a gamble that brought the world closer to the abyss. Hitler's foreign policy was a dance of audacity and deception. The Treaty of Versailles, a hated shackle, had barred Germany from rearming and militarizing the Rhineland, a buffer zone along its western border. In March 1936, Hitler defied this, ordering German troops to march into the Rhineland. The move was a risk. Germany's army was still weak, and France could have responded with force. But Hitler, ever the gambler, sensed the Allies' reluctance. France and Britain, scarred by the Great War and wary of another, hesitated, their protests little more than diplomatic murmurs. The German soldiers, greeted by cheering crowds, fortified the region, and Hitler's confidence soared. In Berlin, he addressed the Reichstag, his voice a mix of defiance and triumph, proclaiming Germany's right to its own destiny. The Rhineland's success emboldened Hitler further. He began to rearm openly, pouring resources into tanks, planes, and warships, defying Versailles with every factory hum. Propaganda films showed gleaming Messerschmitts and disciplined troops, feeding German pride and signaling strength to the world. Hitler's speeches, broadcast to millions, spoke of peace, but his actions told another story. He forged alliances with like-minded regimes, Mussolini's Italy in 1936, and later Japan forming the Axis powers. The Spanish Civil War, erupting that same year, became a testing ground, with German planes and advisors aiding Franco's fascists, honing the Luftwaffe's tactics and showcasing Hitler's growing reach. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria in March 1938, was the next step. Hitler, born an Austrian, had long dreamed of uniting his homeland with Germany, a vision rooted in the pan-German nationalism of his youth. Austria, weakened by political strife, was ripe for the taking. When Austrian Chancellor Kurt Schuschnigg resisted, Hitler pressured him into resignation, and German troops crossed the border, unopposed. In Vienna, where Hitler had once wandered as a failed artist, crowds now cheered him as a conqueror. He stood on the balcony of the Hofburg Palace, his voice echoing through the city, proclaiming a greater Germany. The world watched, uneasy but inactive, as Britain and France issued weak protests, their policy of appeasement holding firm. The Munich Agreement of 1938 was Hitler's boldest triumph yet. His eyes turned to the Sudetenland, a German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, where he stirred unrest by claiming its people were oppressed. Backed by propaganda and threats, he demanded its annexation. Britain's Neville Chamberlain and France's Edouard Daladier, desperate to avoid war, met Hitler in Munich, agreeing to cede the Sudetenland in exchange for promises of peace. Chamberlain returned to London, waving a paper signed by Hitler, declaring peace for our time. But Hitler, in private, scorned their weakness, his appetite only growing. By March 1939, he seized the rest of Czechoslovakia, its defenses crumbling without a fight. The world began to see the futility of appeasement, but the hour was growing late. Hitler's Germany was a nation transformed, its people swept up in a tide of pride and purpose. Rallies in Nuremberg, vast spectacles of light and sound, showcased the Reich's might, with thousands chanting the Führer's name. Yet beneath the pageantry, a darker reality festered. The persecution of Jews intensified, culminating in Kristallnacht in November 1938, when SA thugs smashed Jewish shops and synagogues, their shattered glass glittering like tears in the streets. Tens of thousands were arrested, and the world glimpsed the Reich's brutality, though many still turned away. Hitler's vision of Lebensraum, living space in the East, loomed, his speeches hinting at conquests yet to come. The road to war was now clear, though few wanted to see it. Hitler's pact with Stalin's Soviet Union in August 1939, a cynical deal to divide Eastern Europe, stunned the world. It was a marriage of convenience, two predators agreeing to carve up Poland and beyond. As German tanks massed on the Polish border, the air grew heavy with the weight of what was to come. Hitler, standing in the Reich Chancellery, saw not just a nation, but an empire in the making. What would happen when this man, unchecked by a faltering world, unleashed his ambitions on Europe? Would the nations of the West finally stand, or would they crumble before the storm? As the shadows lengthen over Berlin, let us brace for the moment when the world ignites and a Reich's hunger consumes all. The dawn of September 1, 1939, broke over Poland with a roar that shattered the morning calm. German tanks rumbled across the border, their steel treads grinding the earth, while Luftwaffe planes screamed overhead, raining fire on cities and villages. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the distant cries of a nation under siege. Adolf Hitler, now 50, stood in Berlin's Reich Chancellery, his voice crackling over the radio as he declared war on Poland, claiming provocation. The world, long teetering on the edge, plunged into the abyss of World War II, and the Reich's ambitions, nurtured in Munich's beer halls and honed through years of cunning, set the globe ablaze. The invasion of Poland was no ordinary assault, but a blitzkrieg, lightning war, a strategy of speed and terror that overwhelmed in days what might have taken months. German panzer divisions, backed by air support, sliced through Polish defenses, their precision a testament to years of secret rearmament. Warsaw crumbled under relentless bombing, its streets choked with rubble and despair. Within weeks, Poland was carved up, its eastern half taken by Stalin's Soviet Union under the secret terms of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Britain and France, bound by treaties, declared war on Germany, but their response was sluggish, their armies unprepared for the storm Hitler had unleashed. The Führer's war machine moved with ruthless efficiency. In 1940, Denmark and Norway fell in swift, brutal campaigns, securing Germany's northern flank. Then came the assault on Western Europe. In May, German forces swept through the Netherlands and Belgium, bypassing France's Maginot Line in a daring thrust through the Ardennes. France, once a titan of Europe, collapsed in 6 weeks, its army shattered, its government fleeing. Paris fell on June 14, 1940, its boulevards silent under the shadow of swastika flags. Hitler, in a moment of triumph, toured the conquered city, standing before the Eiffel Tower, his face alight with the realization of his dreams. The Reich now stretched from the Atlantic to the Polish plains, a colossus built on speed and steel. Hitler's vision, laid out in Mein Kampf, was coming to life. He saw himself as a new Napoleon, redrawing the map of Europe. Britain, under Winston Churchill, stood defiant, but Hitler believed it would soon fall. The Battle of Britain began in July 1940, with the Luftwaffe pounding British cities, their bombs turning London into a sea of fire and rubble. Yet, the Royal Air Force, outnumbered but resolute, held the skies, denying Hitler the air superiority needed for invasion. Frustrated, he turned east, his obsession with Lebensraum living space, fixing his gaze on the Soviet Union, a land he saw as both a prize and a threat. Beneath the conquests, a darker machinery was grinding. The Holocaust, the systematic genocide of Europe's Jews, began to take shape. In occupied Poland, ghettos like Warsaw's herded Jews into cramped, starving enclaves, their walls a prison of despair. The Einsatzgruppen, mobile SS killing squads, followed the advancing armies, massacring Jews, Roma, and others deemed undesirable in pits and forests. By 1941, the final solution was conceived, a plan to exterminate millions with industrial precision. Death camps like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor were planned or under construction, their smokestacks a grim omen of the horror to come. Hitler, though rarely directly linked to the orders, set the tone, his hatred for Jews woven into the Reich's core. The German people, swept up in early victories, cheered their Führer. Propaganda films glorified the Wehrmacht, and newsreels showed smiling soldiers in conquered lands. cracks were already forming. The war's demands strained Germany's economy, and rationing tightened belts. Resistance, though small, flickered in occupied territories, and whispers of doubt grew among those who saw the Reich's brutality. Hitler, ensconced in his headquarters, grew more isolated, his decisions driven by a belief in his own infallibility. He surrounded himself with loyalists, Goebbels, Himmler, Goering, each feeding the myth of the unconquerable Führer. In June 1941, Hitler made his boldest move yet, Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. 3 million German troops, supported by Axis allies, surged across the border, their tanks slicing through Soviet defenses. The early months were a triumph, with vast swathes of land captured and Red Army units encircled. Hitler dreamed of Moscow, envisioning a swift victory that would crush communism and secure his Eastern Empire. But the Soviet Union was vast, its people resilient, and winter loomed. As German soldiers marched deeper into Russia, the first signs of overreach appeared. Their supply lines stretched thin across a hostile land. The world was now in flames, and Hitler stood at its center, his ambitions reshaping nations and lives. Yet, the cost of his vision was becoming clear in the burning cities of Poland, the starving ghettos, the blood-soaked fields of Russia. What would happen as the Reich's enemies, from Britain to the Soviets, began to rally? Would Hitler's empire endure, or would the flames he had lit consume him? As the night settles over a war-torn Europe, let us linger on the battlefields, where the tide of war prepares to turn, and a man's hubris faces its first true test. The winter of 1942 blanketed Europe in a frost that seemed to mirror the chill settling over Adolf Hitler's dreams. Berlin, once vibrant with the triumph of early victories, now bore the weight of a war stretching beyond the Reich's grasp. The air carried the scent of coal fires and the distant wail of air raid sirens, as the German people began to feel the strain of a conflict that no longer promised glory. Hitler, now 53, paced the halls of his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia, his maps strewn with markers of conquests that were slipping away. The world he had set ablaze was turning against him, and the tide of war, once a relentless surge, was beginning to ebb, revealing the cracks in his empire. The Battle of Stalingrad, raging from August 1942 to February 1943, was the crucible where Germany's fortunes shattered. The city, a sprawling industrial hub on the Volga, was more than a strategic target. It was a symbol, named for Hitler's Soviet rival, Joseph Stalin. The German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, plunged into a maelstrom of urban warfare, street by street, building by building. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and death, as Soviet defenders, fueled by desperation and resolve, held their ground. Hitler, obsessed with victory, refused to allow retreat, pouring men and resources into the grinder. By November, the the Soviets counterattacked, encircling the Sixth Army in a frozen trap. Starving, freezing, and outgunned, Paulus surrendered in February 1943, with nearly 300,000 German soldiers lost or captured. Stalingrad was not just a defeat, but a wound to the Reich's soul, its myth of invincibility broken. Hitler's response was denial. From his bunkers, he issued orders for phantom armies, his voice sharp with defiance, but increasingly detached. The maps he studied, once a canvas of conquest, now showed red arrows of Soviet advances pushing west. The Eastern Front, stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, was a bleeding wound, with German troops battered by Soviet resilience and the brutal Russian winter. Hitler's generals, once awed by his audacity, began to whisper of his errors, though few dared confront him. His health, too, was faltering, tremors in his hands, sleepless nights, and a reliance on stimulants hinted at a man unraveling under the weight of his own ambition. In the West, the tide turned decisively on June 6, 1944, D-Day. The Allies, led by Britain, the United States, and Canada, landed on the beaches of Normandy, their armada a shadow on the horizon that broke the dawn. Operation Overlord, meticulously planned, was a hammer blow to the Reich's Atlantic Wall. American, British, and Canadian troops stormed ashore under a hail of bullets, their boots sinking into blood-soaked sand. Hitler, slow to react, dismissed the invasion as a feint, delaying reinforcements. By the time he recognized the threat, the Allies had a foothold, their tanks and troops pouring into France. Paris was liberated by August, and the Western Front, long dormant, became a second vice closing on Germany. The Holocaust, meanwhile, reached its horrific peak. Death camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka operated with merciless efficiency, their gas chambers and crematoria claiming millions of lives: Jews, Roma, political prisoners, and others deemed unfit for Hitler's vision. The Wannsee Conference of 1942 had formalized the final solution, and now trains rolled relentlessly to the camps, their cargo human lives reduced to numbers. Reports of the atrocities reached the Allies, but the scale was almost unimaginable, and the war's urgency overshadowed rescue efforts. Hitler, insulated in his headquarters, spoke little of the genocide, but his rhetoric fueled it, his hatred a poison that seeped into every corner of the Reich. Germany's home front was crumbling. Allied bombing raids, led by the RAF and USAAF, turned cities like Hamburg and Dresden into infernos, their skies glowing with the fires of destruction. Civilians huddled in shelters, their faith in the Führer shaken by hunger and loss. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Goebbels, churned out tales of final victory, but the promises rang hollow. Resistance groups, though small, grew bolder, and whispers of dissent spread even among the military. The July 20, 1944, assassination attempt, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, nearly killed Hitler when a bomb exploded at the wolf's lair. He survived, shaken but defiant, and unleashed a brutal purge, executing thousands to crush any hint of betrayal. Hitler's world was shrinking, his empire a fortress under siege, yet he clung to fantasies of wonder weapons and last-ditch offensives, like the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, which briefly stalled the Allies but ended in failure. His generals, caught between loyalty and despair, followed orders they knew were futile. The German people, once swept up in his vision, now faced the cost, a nation in ruins, its future uncertain. What would become of this man, retreating deeper into his delusions as the world closed in? Would his Reich hold, or would it collapse under the weight of its own horrors? As the fires of war burn low, let us follow Hitler to Berlin, where a final stand looms in the shadows of a crumbling empire. In the spring of 1945, Berlin was a city in ruins, its once proud boulevards choked with rubble and the acrid stench of smoke. The air trembled with the thunder of Soviet artillery, closing in like a noose around the heart of the Third Reich. Beneath the shattered streets, in a concrete bunker buried under the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler, now 56, lived out his final days. The bunker's damp walls and flickering lights were a stark contrast to the grand halls he had once commanded, their gloom mirroring the collapse of his dreams. The man who had set the world ablaze now cowered in its ashes, his body frail, his mind fraying, as the Reich he had built crumbled under the weight of its own ambition. The Führer bunker was a claustrophobic labyrinth, its air heavy with the smell of diesel from generators and the sweat of fear. Hitler, his left hand trembling from Parkinson's-like symptoms, shuffled between map rooms and sparse quarters, his eyes sunken, his voice a shadow of its former fire. Surrounded by loyalists, Joseph Goebbels, Martin Bormann, and a dwindling circle of aides, he clung to fantasies of victory. Maps, pinned with markers for armies that no longer existed, covered the tables, and he issued orders for counterattacks that could never come. The Soviet Red Army, now just miles away, was an unstoppable tide, and Berlin's defenders, teenagers, old men, and battered Wehrmacht units, fought with desperation born of futility. Hitler's world had shrunk to these concrete walls, his reality shaped by denial. He ranted about betrayal, blaming generals, allies, and even the German people for failing his vision. The radio brought news of Allied advances, American and British forces sweeping from the west, Soviets from the east, but Hitler dismissed them, speaking of wonder weapons that would turn the tide. His health deteriorated under the strain. Injections of vitamins and stimulants, administered by his doctor, Theodore Morel, kept him functioning, but his once charismatic presence was gone. Those who saw him noted a man aged beyond his years, his gray hair and stooped posture a testament to the toll of war. Life in the bunker was a strange mix of routine and chaos. Aides typed reports, secretaries brewed tea, and Hitler held court in late-night monologues, reminiscing about Munich's beer halls or railing against imagined enemies. Eva Braun, his longtime companion, joined him in the bunker, her presence a quiet defiance of the encroaching end. On April 29, 1945, as Soviet shells shook the earth above, Hitler married Braun in a brief ceremony, a fleeting moment of human connection amid the collapse. The next day, he dictated his final testament, blaming Jews for the war and urging his followers to continue the fight. It was a document of delusion, untouched by remorse. Above ground, Berlin was a hellscape. The city, once a symbol of Hitler's Reich, was reduced to smoldering ruins, its people scavenging for food amid the wreckage. Children wielded rifles in the Hitler Youth, and civilians huddled in cellars, their faith in the Führer shattered by hunger and fear. The Red Army, relentless and vengeful, fought street by street, their tanks grinding through the debris. Reports of atrocities, executions, rapes filtered into the bunker. But Hitler, insulated by his own myth, seemed unmoved. He spoke of fighting to the last man, yet refused to face the front himself, his courage confined to words. On April 30, 1945, the end came as Soviet troops closed in. Just blocks away, Hitler made his final decision. In his private quarters, he and Braun took their lives, Hitler with a cyanide capsule and a bullet to the head, Braun with poison alone. Their bodies, carried to the Chancellery Garden, were doused with petrol and burned, a grim attempt to erase their remains from a world they had scarred. The bunker, now a tomb of fading dreams, fell silent, its occupants fleeing or surrendering. Goebbels and his wife followed suit, poisoning their 6 children before taking their own lives. The Third Reich, built on a decade of fervor and terror, collapsed in a matter of days. Berlin fell on May 2, and Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945. The swastika banners, once proud, were torn down, replaced by the flags of the victors. The Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, was dead in 12. The cost was staggering: millions dead, cities in ruins, and a legacy of horror that would haunt the world. In the bunker's ashes, the man who had dreamed of empire left only devastation, his name a byword for evil. What would become of a world left to reckon with his actions? Would the scars of his Reich heal, or would they linger as a warning for generations? As the smoke clears over Berlin, let us step into the aftermath, where history seeks to judge the man and his legacy. The spring of 1945 faded into a somber dawn over a Europe scarred by war. Berlin, its streets choked with rubble and the ghosts of a fallen Reich, stood silent under the weight of defeat. The air carried the scent of ash and the distant hum of rebuilding. As the world began to reckon with the aftermath of Adolf Hitler's 12-year reign, the Führer was gone, his body reduced to ashes in a Berlin garden. But the shadow he cast stretched far beyond the bunker's walls, from the small town of Braunau to the smoldering ruins of a continent. His life had reshaped history, leaving wounds that would ache for generations and lessons that would echo through time. The collapse of the Third Reich left Germany a shattered land. Cities like Dresden and Hamburg lay in ruins, their spires toppled, their people scavenging for survival. Millions were dead soldiers, civilians, and the 6 million Jews and countless others murdered in the Holocaust's horrors. The camps, liberated by Allied forces, revealed the unimaginable: Auschwitz's barbed wire, Bergen-Belsen's mass graves, the skeletal faces of survivors. The world, confronted with these atrocities, struggled to comprehend the scale of the crime. Hitler's vision of a pure Reich had birthed a genocide that stained the human conscience, its images seared into memory like a wound that would not heal. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in November 1945, sought to bring justice to the Reich's architects. In a courtroom in the battered city of Nuremberg, once a stage for Hitler's rallies, Nazi leaders faced the world's judgment. Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and others sat in the dock, their faces a mix of defiance and defeat. Documents, photographs, and survivor testimonies painted a grim picture of the Holocaust and the war's devastation. The trials, broadcast to a weary world, were more than a reckoning. They were a declaration that such crimes would not go unanswered. Göring, sentenced to death, took his own life. Others faced the gallows, their fates a small measure of closure for a world still reeling. Hitler's legacy was not confined to Germany. The war he ignited had redrawn maps and reshaped destinies. Europe, divided between East and West, entered a Cold War, its scars fueling tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. Israel, born in 1948, rose from the ashes of the Holocaust, a homeland for a people nearly destroyed. The United Nations, forged in the war's aftermath, sought to prevent such horrors, its charter a fragile promise of peace. Yet, the cost of Hitler's ambition lingered: families torn apart, cultures erased, and trust in humanity shaken by the depths to which it had fallen. In Germany, the process of denazification began, a painful effort to purge Nazi ideology from institutions and minds. Former party members were tried or sidelined, and swastikas were scrubbed from public spaces. But the scars were deeper than laws could reach. Ordinary Germans, many of whom had cheered Hitler's rise, grappled with guilt and denial. Some claimed ignorance of the camps, others whispered of their own suffering under Allied bombs. Rebuilding was not just physical, but moral. A nation forced to confront the monster it had followed. Schools taught the truth, memorials rose, and slowly, Germany began to forge a new identity, one rooted in remorse and renewal. The world, too, learned lessons from Hitler's shadow. His rise, built on economic despair and nationalist fervor, warned of the dangers of unchecked demagogues. His propaganda, masterminded by Goebbels, showed how words could twist truth and inflame hatred. The Holocaust, a crime of industrial scale, underscored the fragility of human rights and the need for vigilance. Historians pored over Mein Kampf, tracing the roots of his ideology to the resentments of Vienna and the trenches. Scholars debated how a man, once a nobody, could bend a nation to his will. Their answers a mosaic of charisma, circumstance, and collective despair. Yet, Hitler's legacy was not just a warning, but a mirror. His ability to exploit fear and division resonated in later conflicts, from genocides in Rwanda to ethnic purges in the Balkans. The swastika, once a symbol of ancient hope, became a universal emblem of evil, its image banned in many lands. Memorials like Yad Vashem in Jerusalem and the Holocaust Museum in Washington stood as testaments to the lost, their stories a plea to never forget. The phrase, "never again," became a rallying cry, though the world would struggle to live up to it, as new atrocities tested its resolve. As we reflect on this man, born in a quiet Austrian town, we see a life that began with dreams of art and ended in a bunker's despair. Hitler's story is not just his own, but a cautionary tale of what happens when hatred is given a voice, when fear is weaponized, and when a nation surrenders to a single man's will. What does his shadow teach us as we lie under the stars of a different time? Will we heed the lessons of his rise, or will history whisper its warnings in vain? As the night deepens and the world turns toward healing, let us carry these questions into our dreams, remembering the cost of silence and the power of truth. As the echoes of this story fade into the quiet of the night, I hope you found yourself lost in the currents of history, carried gently toward reflection, or perhaps even sleep. This journey through Adolf Hitler's life, from a boy in Braunau to the architect of a world in flames, reminds us of the power of choices, the weight of words, and the fragility of peace. I'm so grateful you've joined me, Sherry, on this path through time, and I'd love to hear from you as we close this chapter. Where are you right now, listening to these tales? Maybe you're tucked under a blanket in Sydney, where the stars are just beginning to fade. Or perhaps you're in a cozy corner of Chicago, the midnight hour soft around you. Drop a comment below and share your corner of the world. What's the time there? And what struck you most about this story? Your thoughts breathe life into these histories, and I read every single one. If these stories resonate with you, consider subscribing and tapping the bell icon so we can explore more together. Each week, we dive into the past, weaving narratives to soothe and inspire. Sharing this video with a friend or adding it to your playlist helps keep these tales alive. And I'm honored to have you as part of this community. For more journeys through history, check out our other videos, linked below, where we uncover the lives and legacies that shaped our world. Thank you for being here, for lending your ears and your hearts to these stories. Until next time, May your dreams be gentle, and may history's lessons guide us all toward a brighter tomorrow. Good night.